How does it feel to be culture shocked? How does it feel to migrate to a nation where the language is completely different to what you're used to? The customs are different than what you're used to. And even certain conduct related to behavior is completely different to what you're used to. Chinese cartoonist Makee is trying to provide a perspective for this concern in her debut graphic novel titled Call Me Emma. So, let's talk about a few things that stood out to me personally from the story combined with the art itself. Chapter 1 of the story immediately jumps into what is one of the biggest ordeals that our main character Yizhuan starts going through, which, as I'm sure many of us at least age 20 and above are familiar, the infamous or famous high school. Once she starts going to high school, she looks up at this tall building belonging to Rivervale High School, and she stops and quite literally looks up at the building for what seems like a hot minute or two before finally going in. That, to me at least, suggests that in combination with the cross that she was looking at earlier, suggests that she's literally looking up at somebody or something or some sort of forces that are bigger than her. Or should I say, higher than herself. Okay. And once she finally does go inside, she's compelled to immediately start blending in with the rest of the students who are significantly different than she is. Perhaps needless to say. Man, can we stop for a second to just appreciate this crowd scene which Makee did in the very opening pages of the book? It's pretty cool in the sense that the focal point, which is our main character shot from the back and being placed smack in the center with slightly more distinct blacks, mostly in her hair, in comparison to the rest of the figures, suggests that, yes, this is indeed a figure who's standing out from the rest of the crowd, almost like that classic story Ugly Duckling is at least what I'm getting from this. Making or drawing a crowd scene in combination with a perspective drawing is not easy. Okay, I could say this for sure because I may have illustrated a page or two like that myself also. In that sense, my dear artist Makee, if you are watching this, then good job practicing a lot of patience in there and coming up with such a variety in faces and hairstyles as well. And to further sort of highlight the point that our main character Yijuan is indeed bit of a, dare I say, outsider of the school at this point. She immediately gets approached by questions like, "Are you from China? Does China have McDonald's?" She also gets bewildered a little bit by US history as well as the habitual pledge of allegiance that each student needs to do every single day. As if that wasn't already interesting enough, now she also has to her surprise, quite literally line up to the bathroom and very politely ask permission to go to the bathroom as well. By the way, if you're somebody who's living outside of the US and watching this, that's how it actually is in a typical American high school. Like, okay, at this point of the story, I already started feeling relatable because not only did my peers and I have to ask for permission to go to the bathroom, but we would also have to request for a hall pass that we would have to show to a hall monitor, which was basically like a security guard specializing in just looking at the hallways, making sure that nobody's doing too much nonsense in the bathroom or anywhere else. And on top of that, yes, indeed, at least with me, homeroom would have the Pledge of Allegiance with the hand on your heart every single morning when school was in session. And on top of that, even the lunchtime was highly regulated. I'm talking a situation where, first of all, lunch was divided into 3 sections, okay? And each section had only a very limited amount of students, and we would have to literally sit there waiting for permission to leave the dining hall and go about our business. So, at the time, I already found myself thinking, but of course I knew better than to voice those opinions, that, like, yo, this is almost like one of those prison-themed movies. You know what I mean? Because those were similar in the sense that in there you would also have your life regimented at least throughout the day, to the point where you might have to even sit still and not wander off on your own until you are given permission to. Anyways, then the story moves on to what I actually found one of the most interesting things, as in at least providing one perspective of what might be going on in the headspace of a typical Chinese person living in the US in terms of switching their given name to a English one, often voluntarily. And Yijuan decides to do so also, mainly, I guess, inspired by a couple of challenging interactions where the person she was interacting with either didn't want to learn to pronounce her name correctly or just said, like, screw it, I don't even want to try. But either way, she does like many of her other Chinese peers do, and switches her name to a English one, Emma, hence the title of the graphic novel, probably. And yeah, it's kind of funny that very soon after that, like, it turns out that Emma is actually a very common name, I guess, till this day. So we start having that humor in there, as I mentioned in the previous video. In that same former American high school of mine, I remember I met a Japanese exchange student who had a more typical Japanese name that I found pretty effortless to pronounce, maybe partially because I was watching a lot of anime at the time, but some of our peers and the people in his host family either simply didn't want to pronounce his name, or didn't even want to make a serious effort to pronounce his real name, or for whatever damn reason they just decided that, hey, it's better to give him the English name. I remember already at the time thinking to myself, like, especially after I met a couple of other exchange students and immigrants who also had English names that weren't really given to them from birth. I found myself thinking, like, bro, why? I kind of as secretly called him with his Japanese name, but then when I finally moved to the US myself and met a handful of Chinese peers of mine in college, each of whom either insisted that I use their English name, or kind of just was like, yeah, whatever, I guess you can call me by this name that was given to me. But either way, I realized that it was actually a thing that some immigrants to the US do. And I would always find that a little bit strange, because already at the time I was very much aware that somebody's name may have some sort of a deep meaning behind it, either through some sort of another language, or related to some sort of a culture, or some sort of a philosophy. Almost without failure, I would always find myself thinking that, well, bro, that's something that one should cherish and be proud of, to the point where, regardless of whether or not the person you're introducing yourself to knows how to pronounce it, you might want to insist that they use your given name anyway. As you might be able to tell, I don't speak Chinese, and nor do I understand it, and the linguistics related to that are something that my mouth is not trained in. But I'm still not gonna use that as an excuse to just not even try to pronounce your real name, your real given name. Okay? And I do that with other so-called foreigners also. Apart from the occasional person who who really does see some kind of meaning in an English name and kind of insists that I use. But if it's not a case like that, I generally prefer to use people's given names. But on the other hand, I kind of understand the sort of annoyance related to that situation where you as an immigrant with a bit of a unusual name in this country have some linguistics attached to that name that might not fit into the average American mouth. For a little while, I went around with my English nickname Jay, which, for those of you who didn't know, is not actually my given name. It's close, but not really. But I'll also get to that maybe later. And it wasn't until this one peer of mine who speaks a little bit of Hebrew and who kind of randomly came up to me one day after class saying like, hey, so if you want a meaning for your name, it actually comes from Hebrew tradition, meaning God will give. And yeah, should you be interested in that, you could look up what it relates to. And that just strengthened the previous point I was making, that names could have some sort of a deep meaning attached to it. And I would make the argument that they must not be treated lightly, as in just sort of suppressing it in the form of a nickname. The story also makes several parts that give a little quick lesson about Chinese culture, like this page titled How to Distinguish a Chinese Household. It shows this more Western and Chinese style garden, according to the author, kind of juxtaposed to each other. And this was also some interesting stuff because I go to college in Flushing, and I always, in the spring and the summertime, admire the really vibrant colors that some people have in their front yard where they grew stuff like lettuce and tomatoes and spinach and whatnot. I always thought that those people just happened to be green thumbs, but I didn't know that it is actually somewhat of a Chinese cultural thing to grow your own vegetables and herbs. Yeah, and then another thing about the culture is that it also goes into this old Chinese joke. It's in essence like a Chinese man traveled abroad and had a car accident. The police came to check on him, saying, "How are you, sir?" Thinking of the English he had learned. "I'm fine, thank you." Yeah. And maybe it's partially on me because I really dig this kind of humor, so that might be playing into why this page is also pretty funny. But it also touches on an interesting aspect about the more conversational English we have around here, which is many people's habit of asking, "How are while they're greeting each other. I mean, while while the joke is kind of funny, it also highlights an interesting point where like that typical answer that people give to that question is like, "Oh, I'm fine. How are you?" might not really work for every situation because first of all, each and every one of us, I'm sure, has really days like the guy depicted in this page has on maybe a more mental level where things are actually far from fine. So I always wondered, like, why would people ask that? I myself come from Finland, and if you've ever been there, you may have noticed that people don't really talk to each other like that, especially not when they haven't really deeply connected like that. And not to mention the question, how are you? Like, okay, some people ask each other that, but that's usually like friends who truly consider each other friends, you know. And that part of the culture in my home country has stuck to me till this day. So if you're somebody if who's actually met me and you're watching this, you may have noticed that when when you ask me that question, how's it going, or what's going on, or how are you, I don't really like to answer that exactly because of that, because especially if I'm having a shitty day, chances are that, especially if I don't really consider you a friend or even a good associate, I'm not gonna wanna lie to you just for the sake of maintaining a good vibe or whatever. It generally, like, nah, I'm not going there. But personally, at least among the top 3 favorite pages in the whole book has got to be this one that in essence say that there were only 2 options: learn how to swim or drown. I find that really creative because that to me sounds like an alternative to that popular saying we have in the US, kill or be killed. You gotta either proactively adjust to the environment while avoiding potential enemies. Another interesting idea about social matters in China in particular, brought up by this book, is this page that kind of in my mind I found myself calling Children Mind Factory. That's essentially what is depicted here, with these kids starting off as athletic and really outgoing and creative and things of that nature, but then kind of being put through a machine and then becoming something that the majority of society would consider more quote unquote appropriate. And this is not really a original idea. I've seen a few other illustrations that were similar to this, but I still like how Makee put her own little twist on the very next page by suggesting this kind of hierarchy structure that some high schools and, dare I say, society as a whole tends to have. And if you don't kind of conform to that, then you may have your individuality, but some of the world around you may crumble as well, and you might be seen as a defect. again, in the perspective of the majority of society. And speaking of standards of the majority of society, I also liked another quick lesson that the artist titled Six Steps to Attaining Chinese Beauty. Probably somewhat sarcastically, but I still found that some awesome social commentary nonetheless, because you look at it, it suggests things like a pale skin tone, a slim body, and some volume on the chest and the buttocks on women in particular, along with preferably straight hair. That's apparently a beauty standard in China, but I would go as far as to say that it's a beauty standard just about everywhere. That would make its own lengthy conversation topic, so maybe that's outside of the scope of this video. But for now, I'll just say that based on having visited multiple parts of the world, multiple continents in the world, and having learned about many different kinds of societies, not to mention having, for better or worse, at least up until recently, consumed large amount of pop culture, this standard rings true till this day, for better or worse, and probably has rang true for centuries. At least ever since colorism first started becoming a thing, and the systemic racism that closely ties to it. But again, that'll probably make its own video for when I do run into a comic that goes more deeply into this topic. In fact, feel free to recommend a comic like that, and I'll be happy to make a follow-up video about colorism and these beauty standards that go with it in its own video. This is not to say that I'm an expert on these matters, it's far from it, but I will say that I've been occupied with these kinds of matters for a little while, both on a more, I guess you could say, conversational level, as well as a more academic level. But what I can lecture about the topic real quick is that the story also goes into a fair amount of detail of what being an immigrant and representing a marginalized group far away from your home country can be like. More so, it discusses it from a mental health perspective, and that we see in the main character's sister by the name of Yiwen. She starts going through some sort of challenges in the story, and those challenges affect the dynamics not just between Yizhuan and Yiwen, but also between Yiwen and the rest of the people in her social circle. And that becomes a interesting kind of blend between the very necessary drama that one would like to see in just about any kind of a story, and also a quick lesson on mental health issues from one perspective at least, and I'm guessing a real life perspective. So, in conclusion, again, Call Me Emma offers a nice and soothing blend between story with a beginning, middle, conflict, and a resolution, and everything in between in a diligently structured manner, while providing education on Chinese culture, immigrating to the US as a Chinese immigrant, and a variety of social issues that one may experience while going through all of that. If something like this resonates with you, check out the author and artist Makee on either Instagram or Amazon or her own website. I'll link everything in the description below related to finding her. And as usual, if you like this little speech of mine, consider hitting all the necessary engagement buttons, ranging from the like to subscribe, the little bell that will give you notifications, and now you can also actually check out my page on Ko-fi, where you can, as they like to say on that service, buy me a coffee if you really enjoy this content to the point where you would like to see something like this weekly. That would very much help the creation of this podcast as well as other works of mine, which I will also link in the description below. In the meantime, if you really made it this far and really listened for this long, you have my humble thanks. And with that, I hope you do take care, and I will speak to y'all more in the next review. Bye.